Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Jed Hartley, son of a prophet and former member of the International House of Prayer. Jed, it's been a weird series of events. The research will have been published a long time before this actually comes out, but I was digging into Paul Cain, and it was purely by accident. I've actually forgotten more research than I have published. I was looking for something else, and I was going through the newspapers, and oh my gosh, there's the Granny Bandit. I had forgotten about the Granny Bandit, and so started digging into that, and anyway, one thing led to another, and we were talking today about Joel's army, and I found where Paul Cain was, and we'll get into it further, but he was deeply embedded into the Joel's army ideology way back in the 50s, before any of the International House of Prayer, and have not yet published this, which I'll surprise you maybe a little bit, but it wasn't his first rodeo. Pretty much everything that he did at International House of Prayer, he just redid from earlier versions of his quote-unquote prophecies. He rebranded them, changed the details, and said, oh, lo and behold, I have a prophecy, and the world will end. Be scared.
Once you find what works, just recycle it, right?
Absolutely. It's so ridiculous to think that there are men that actually do this kind of thing. And
yeah.
I have to put people in different categories, because some people are mentally unstable and they do them because they can't help it. And I truly feel sorry for them, even though I realize many of them might be preying upon individuals. I understand that, but I have a bit of compassion for people who need help and just don't get it. But some of them do it with a malicious intent. And I haven't really put Paul Cain into a category yet, but I really don't see too many signs of mental health issues with him. It looks like he was just a rotten to the core kind of guy. And so I'm still categorizing him, but whenever I look at the mess that he created, he seemed to attract a lot of people that did have mental health issues.
Those mental illnesses kind of fester within the community, where if it was something that was addressed in your 20s and 30s, you could have dealt with it, but instead it kind of preys upon that, tells, if you're hearing voices in your head, tells them people that it is from God, and to lean into it rather than to recognize it as mental health. But then, yes, you have the people like Paul Cain, who, whether probably it's just grandiose delusion and selfishness or whatever motivates these individuals, but it is very eerie when someone is very put together and are lying to the extent that someone like Paul Cain was, or are being deceptive to that point, because it just feels like, why would you even do this? Why would you have this behavior if you are put together? Like, you could just go be a business owner. You could live a very normal life. What is it that's driving you to create these end times apocalyptic false prophecies, and then draw in people who do have mental illnesses, and create a community that is surrounding these apocalyptic and deceptive practices? It's perplexing, for sure.
I'm convinced that there's more money in it and less work in it than an actual business. So there's that, Yeah. But, a lot of people that I've studied joined for different reasons. Like, some of the guys that I've studied in the ancient history, I can say clearly had maybe they weren't insane mentally, but they had some real problems. And so they really believed some of the nonsense they said. And then what's interesting is some of them seem to have stabled out, but they built such a following around the nonsense that they said when they were a little bit mentally disturbed. And they started believing the stuff that they said while they were mentally challenged. So that's a weird category that I don't even know where to place those guys. But then there are other people who there was clearly a strategy and they saw the money involved. And like John Alexander Dowie, there's no way that guy did not know that he was doing what he was doing. There towards the end, he did lose his mental capacities, but after he had swindled, I can't remember how many millions of dollars back then. So you've got different categories of people, and I'm still trying to form an opinion of the whole thing, because one crazy guy and his ridiculous prophecies that nobody who is Christian today, even in the Pentecostal movement, would have believed. They would have all said this is nonsense today. But they're stepping stones of history to get all the way up to the charismatic movement. And so there's this clear problem, and you can't just say, well, all of charismania is rotten to the core. It's not. But there's all these building blocks that get there, and the building blocks that get there are rotten to the core. So what do you do with that, you know? Yeah,
the foundation of the house is certainly built on unstable ground is probably an understatement of that. And it is really difficult to then be in your shoes or my shoes, where you're trying to call out the fissures and the cracks in the foundation, because it feels like you can't do that without criticizing the movement at as a whole. But it's just so foundational to the way that the movement has developed. And you do have the same characters, Dowie and Sanford, and then Branham and Bickle and Jones, and they just play by a lot of the same play sheet, and it's pretty impossible to extract their impact on the charismatic church from that sort of church history.
And then to further complicate it, especially today, so we're recording this way ahead of when it's going to be released. Today is actually the day of elections between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So today,
I got my vote sticker on there.
I don't have mine.
I haven't yet. I haven't casted it yet, but
I don't have mine. Everybody, it's funny. I read through the comments, and they all are certain who I would vote for, and they have no clue, man. They have no clue. But you look at today's political mess, and it's more than just a political mess. It's a political religious mess. And me saying that, I think, is why they falsely assume who I would vote for. But it is a political mess, and religion has wrapped itself around politics because they want to control politics and make it part of their domain, their dominion.
Yes.
Well, this is nothing new. If you go back and you study history, every single evil, vile character that I've mentioned in the past, John Alexander Dowie included, every single one of them wanted to manipulate and control politics, because if the laws are written to stop the swindlers, then their whole empire crumbles. So they want to be able to control those laws, and they want to embed themselves in government. So what we see going on today with religion and politics, I can find you hundreds, thousands of newspapers where it's happening back in the 1900s. And, you know, you go back before that, I'm certain it happened in the 18th, 16th, 15th, as far back as you want to go. But what's interesting to me is that because of the Pentecostal movement, stringing it together through different waves of Pentecostalism, things like Joel's Army, which was a gross misinterpretation of Scripture, were taken and carried forward through those movements and then repeated today. And the mess that we have today is actually largely because of that. And Paul Cain, Mike Bickle, these guys, they help resurrect the latter-rain version of this Joel's Army doctrine.
So the Joel's Army, even that doctrine itself, its roots, correct me if I'm wrong, but its roots are in the latter rain movement, right? And that Branham, Jim Jones also had the Joel's Army, or the Manifest Sons of God. Were those two related, the Manifest Sons of God and the Joel's Army doctrines?
Absolutely. So there's a prophecy. The reason it's called Joel's Army is because it comes from a chapter in the book of Joel in the Old Testament. Pentecostalism, the new modern Pentecostalism, which started in 1907, was largely based off of a passage from Joel 2 talking about the former and the latter rains. So if you go back in the New Testament and you read what the apostles are saying about the former and latter rain. They're saying this day today, the day of Pentecost in the New Testament, is the former rain to the latter rain to the former rain that happened years ago, right? Well, then modern Pentecostalism said, well, no, that's today. Let's ignore what the apostles said and let's claim it for today. And they did it because of British Israelism. With British Israelism, they were able to take specific passages out of context that was meant for another culture in the ancient world, and then apply it. They would say it applies in twofold. It was in shadow back then, and now we're seeing it fulfilled today. And then they can vaguely say one single sentence from the Old Testament, ripped out of context, applies to the president or the former president who's running, or the existing president's vice president who's running. They can really apply it to anything they want. So what happened was that wave of Pentecostalism from the early 1900s began to fade away. Latter rain was another wave of Pentecostalism that brought new vigor and excitement. And so they started saying, no, we're the former rain to the latter rain of the original Pentecostals at 1907 Azusa Street. So they're just repeating this idea that they can take that one phrase and rip it out of context and apply it. Well, if you read that prophecy and understand what it means to the ancient world, it is talking about wars and battles, and it's talking about plagues, and there's an army of locusts that attack, basically. Yeah. And they're talking about the crops that aren't producing, the vegetables and the fruit for the people to eat. They're talking about God sending famine, basically, in this prophecy. Well, because the word army was used, and if you continue through the book of Joel, you start to see there's some very militant terms that are used there. Well, remember the World War I and II had just happened whenever the latter rain broke out. They were looking very closely that a third world war would break out. So they thought it would. And so they're applying that prophecy to the war that they feel is impending. Then you had the rise of communism. So they kept just regurgitating the same mistake over and over and over and over again. And it all applies back to that prophecy from the book of Joel. Well, today, now that Russia's starting to flex its muscles and it looks like there is going to be wars in different parts of the world, they're able to reuse that even further today. So it's interesting. If you go back and look at what was happening, whenever the prophecies were being revised in the 80s and 90s, all of the different global conflicts that were happening. I don't have the recordings, but I'll bet you could go back to each one of those ministers and they could apply it to the current state of events back in the 80s in the same way that they did in the late 40s.
Yeah, well, even in the way that I've seen the Joel's Army prophecies used, I've seen that evolution in my own life, only being 33 years old or 32, however old I am, 32 years old. When I was very young, there were several different schools that IHOP was setting up. There was what was called the Children Equipping Center, which was kind of like the ministry, children's ministry. We would go off. It was led by a man named Lenny LaGuardia, and we would have these meetings that were just like normal Sunday school children's meetings, but there was a heavy emphasis on prophetic and the gifts of the Spirit, on being able to speak in tongues, being able to interpret that. There was a lot of like interpretive dance that we did. There was a lot of like sort of manifestations of the Holy Spirit that we were encouraged to learn and operate in. And during that time, there was what Bob Jones was kind of prophesying over the community that even preceded IHOP. So this was the Kansas City Fellowship or Metro Christian Fellowship that preceded the International House of Prayer, the prophecies were about these like young children growing up and having being an army. The metaphor was the Gideon's army, where it was going to be only 300 or so that was going to change the battle. And instead of being 300, I think it was the prophecy that Bob Jones gave was that there was going to be billions or 1 billion people who were led to Jesus in this final hour, and that there was going to be an army of 300,000 young adults who were equipped with prophecy, with healing, with speaking in tongues, being able to do all of these miracles of the Spirit, and that my generation was going to be the ones who kind of led this end times army through the gifts of the Spirit. And then there was a lot of prophecy about Truman and Harry Truman in Kansas City, and that there was going to be symbols that this church, IHOP, was going to be the forerunner end times church, and it was going to have to do with a march that was led from the church to Harry Truman's property, which, when I was young, the prophecy was about the Arrowhead Stadium, because like we've talked about in the past, it was all about football. That's how Bob Jones grounded a lot of his prophecies. But the Arrowhead Stadium and the Kauffman Stadium, which is the Kansas City Chiefs football stadium, is Arrowhead, and then the Kansas City Royals is Kauffman Stadium. That whole complex was called the Truman Sports Complex. And so the idea was that there was going to be a massive revival, and that they were going to basically sell out that entire complex was going to be filled, and that there was going to be this march from Metro or from wherever all the way down to that stadium. And that was the very specific prophecy. But then Mike Bickle turned it into a prophecy about Truman properties instead of it being about Harry Truman's the Truman Sports Complex. It turned into a prophecy about the Truman properties in general. And lo and behold, Truman had a several mile development that he had owned and been a part of the development that was called Truman Corners. That was in Grandview, Missouri. There was buildings that were for sale in that area. Mike Bickle buys that building, or actually my father was a part of putting the trailers on that building. And then there was another, the Global Prayer Room that they bought. And basically it was just all this sort of fulfillment of property or prophecy, because they were on Truman's property. That was never actually what the prophecy was originally about, but it became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they were able to make it happen by buying property that was once Harry Truman's property. And that's where the Global Prayer Room came about. But anyway, all of this to say is that there was all of these prophecies about the Joel's army raising up and about Harry Truman's property. And it turned into all of these prophecies about Israel. And now that Mike Bickle is under the gun, he's really hammering all of this sort of prophecy about the nation of Israel. And of course, there's a lot going on in the nation of Israel right now, as there has been for the last, since Israel became a nation back in 1946, was it? So anyway, all that to say is that the way that these prophecies sort of bubble up and are about one thing, but then they change and they're about another thing. But I'm fascinated by how much it focused on the youth, and how much it really was this indoctrination process that I grew up in, where it was like we were being trained for one specific purpose, and it was very militant. It was always about the gifts of the Spirit. It was Joel's army and they were going to have spiritual warfare be their warfare. But it was very militaristic. It used a lot of that language. It was extremely intense. And what's crazy is that I feel like that has been a pattern since the latter rain movement even began. It always has been this focus on the raising up the young generation to be spiritual fighters and spiritual warriors who go and do battle. And it's a terrible, terrible environment to be raised in. I know that I've said something very similar to this in previous episodes, but I want to hammer it home. That is just an awful way to grow up, because there's this absolute fear on your life. Because I think that there's going to be an actual war that's happening that I'm going to be a part of, and that to win the war, I need to be this spiritual warrior who can move in the gifts of the Spirit. But guess what? I can't actually prophesy and get divine information about the people who I'm not actually a miracle worker. When I pray for my sister who hurt her leg, her leg still hurts. The healings aren't happening. The prophecies aren't happening. And so there's a war coming, and I am not actually equipped to be in that war, and yet I'm supposed to be one of the leaders of that war.
Like you said, it's been a theme recurring over and over and over again. So you mentioned the nation of Israel. That was one of the key factors that really birthed the latter rain, because the nation of Israel had just formed whenever all of this broke out. So they saw this as a quote-unquote spiritual sign. So you've got British Israelism. We're taking the passages of the Old Testament that applied to Israel. We're saying it applies to us, and lo and behold, the nation of Israel is born. So you can see how they kind of pieced all of that together.
Yeah.
And then it's really so weird when you think about it. You had William Branham and his mentor, Roy Davis, the head of the Klan, who were going to spiritualist camps. One of the largest spiritualist camps in the nation was in Indiana. So they're going there to learn how they did these tricks and gimmicks. And they convinced the locals that the gimmicks were real, that these were real spirits that they were resurrecting. So it's a good versus evil. The spirits are rising. We need spiritual warfare to attack the evil. You can actually go, you can read books, and I think there may even be a video on the spiritualist camp in Indiana. They talked about how it was all a hoax. They never really dreamed that it would get as big as it did, and it did. But they had things like a levitating piano that would play dun 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 dun, the Beverly Hillbillies ending, right? And people back then believed this, right? And so in today's world, it would never fly. If I'm trying to picture a world where Paul Cain and Bob Jones went into Kansas City and said, "We believe the spirits are coming, and they're going to play the Beverly Hillbillies jingle on a piano, and we must have spiritual warfare." There's not a single person that would come to this. But Branham did it back then, and he goes on tour, and you can find, I've got some articles on this, but you can find references of statements from the men who are saying that Branham went and he would do things like move bracelets in the air, or he could cause things to move with his mind. Basically all of the tricks that he's learning in these spiritualist camps. And he's convincing the people that they needed spiritual warfare because spiritualism is rising in the U.S., which it was. And we see this global war that is about to break out, and the nation of Israel has just formed. So you take all of these elements, and it was the perfect storm. So they started to create an army of spiritual warriors. But it's not spiritual in the way that you would think of it as a Christian.
Right.
They were literally training them to move objects with their mind and thinking they had the power of doing this, right?
Yeah.
And nobody in today's world would believe it. So I have to laugh. I've read through some of the quote-unquote prophetic history at IHOP. They fail to mention the important parts like that. Like IHOPKC lists their prophetic history and then cuts it off. But if you trace it all the way back, there's not a single person that would believe this nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, hope that you're right, that no one would believe this nonsense today. Like, it feels like this is something that was in the past, that there wouldn't be people who get tricked by some of these tricks. Although there are, I don't know if you saw, there was this big Lou Engle led, I can't remember what it was called, but there was this big gathering quite recently that was like the Women's March. It was very political. It was very pro-Trump, and I think it was geared towards women, and it was like women, but it was a part of this sort of larger charismatic movement. And it's interesting because I've been reading up on some of the people who were, I don't know if the right word is preaching or giving messages, some of the leaders of that event. And one of them, she talks about werewolves, and she talks about how there's this spiritual warfare going on, and that she has met changelings and werewolves who are hiding amongst the group, and very seriously and very genuinely. And she was up there along with a lot of people who were partners with my dad in different ministry settings. Like, it was weird to see some of these individuals up there and just know, hey, they saw all of my dad's sort of prophetic grift, and they didn't have any problem with it. And so as much as it seems like some of these con artists of the past are just in the past, there are present day manifestations of this, that maybe it's not about levitating pianos anymore. Maybe the tricks are changing, but these fearful, bizarre stories about werewolves. And I think honestly, it's just a continuation of the serpent seed sort of rhetoric that William Branham had, of that there are people amongst us. I mean, it obviously like pairs with a lot of the conspiracy theories about reptilian people running the government and some of those wild things that you don't think anybody actually genuinely and seriously believes those things. But Bob Jones talked about he used a lot of that seed rhetoric, a lot of the idea of there are generations that are set apart from different generations, and whether it was very explicit with Branham, of it being like you can't race mix because race mixing is destroying God's people, or I don't even know how Branham totally grounded his obvious racism, but that was that sort of fear mongering of like, there is a group of people in the world who are not fully human, that their seed has been tainted either by the Nephilim seed or by, I guess, werewolves now, whatever it is, that this has been a very common trick and story. And I would love to think that it is fading out. I would love to see us as like both Christians and just as human beings be able to rise above a lot of this clearly insane and extremely destructive and horrific rhetoric. But I think these tricks are still going to get played, and people are still going to fall for them.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. Wherever there's a charismatic minister who can prey upon victims and find victims, they will do it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I look back at some of the way that this developed over time, and the patterns are just, for me, it's the patterns that really give you the full detail, because it wasn't a move by God, clearly. Whenever you can see that men who were either having mental health issues or they were seeking to get power, money, fame, sex, all of the things that these guys are doing, creating building blocks leading up to this great event. The problem that I see in the way in which they're preying on the victims is that they're portraying a God that is giving this spiritual insight to this small group of people, while there are many, many other Christians in the world, right? But they're saying that we have this knowledge. We're going to be the spiritual elite. We're going to be the spiritual warriors. In your case, we're going to be commanding the army of spiritual warriors against the demons. Well, where is the recruitment for all of the other Christians in the world? That's the problem that I began to face as I started examining this, because even in the cities where latter rain is developing, you find in the newspapers the surrounding churches. And so you've got the latter rain church here who's saying the world is ending and we need to be ready to fight the spiritual war. Well, over in the in the next building might even be adjacent or across the street, there's a group of really good Christian people who believe God, and they believe Jesus is coming too. It's not like they're anti-Christian, right? But you don't see them going out and trying to say, hey, look, we must band together as one. Instead, it's we must band together separately. And that really was the key. Once I realized that these guys they have a strategy of separating Christians, isolating a specific group of people who will believe them, and then the whole rest of Christians are completely ignored. And to a large extent, if you follow all of their doctrines out to its conclusion, they're ignored by God. So I began to realize either we have a ridiculous God who doesn't know how to lead a war, or they're lying about the war, or they just don't understand the coming war. So, I'm piecing all this together, and I go back in time and I'm looking at most of these guys base all of their end of days theology, as you know, off the book of Revelation. Well, you can go back every century all the way back to 70 AD. They were all saying, this is it. I don't know if you've seen Sanford and Son. It's one of my favorite shows growing up. He would say, this is the big one. And they were all like, this is the big one. This is it. We must be ready. Revelation says clearly, can't you see it? Over and over, every single century, half century, all back through time. And I finally came to the conclusion that nobody knows. And if anybody says, we know, but we're not going to let those other Christians know, then this has to be somebody who's either off their rocker or they're trying to deceive you. Yeah.
Well, and I think that you absolutely nailed it of using the word isolating, just like it's an isolating doctrine. It's an isolating experience. It's an isolating community where the goal is not, they have no grasp or understanding or even desire to graft in other churches with slightly different doctrines, not even extending beyond just non-Christians. It just even within the Christian world, there's just no place for people who are not explicitly a part of this isolating extremist doctrine. And again, going back to what it is like to be raised in that, I remember so many experiences that I had as a kid where I grew up having friends who were not within the IHOP world who, like my mother, got me and my sisters involved in a co-op group that was other homeschooled Christian believers within Kansas City. But it wasn't all IHOP specifically. And so I even went to a prep school for a few of my like junior high years. That was more of a conventional, probably evangelical, just a typical evangelical school. And I remember feeling this isolating experience when I would then talk about the One Thing conferences, or when I would talk about religion in general. There was just this sort of like, I am supposed to be a part of something that's different and greater. But because it's not greater, because I'm not operating in the gifts of the Spirit, because I can't do healing, it is just different. There's no greater. Like, I'm supposed to be the city set on a hill. I'm supposed to be the example. And I'm just set apart for no good reason. I'm just kind of different and isolated. And then even within the community, building friends and whatnot, like it just was all of this extremely isolating, very radical, very intense community that made friendships and normal relationships so difficult. And you can see why predators, sexual predators specifically, would find so much success. I don't know if success is the right word, but who would prey upon those communities, because isolating young women and young men, but isolating young individuals is the way that you successfully prey upon young individuals. And so there's this community that isolates everyone. Of course, there's going to be rampant sexual abuse that happens in there because it's not going to be reported, and there's not good ways for people to understand and talk with each other and have normal conversations, much less conversations about something that's really terrifying and difficult, or talking about, the failure of your leaders. So, incredibly isolating. From the top to the bottom, just all of the experiences were so isolating.
I remember when I was in it, I was fascinated with cults. I studied Jim Jones, and I studied different guys. I can't remember the guy's name, but was it the Haley Bopp Comet guy that basically gathered a bunch of people together and said, the comet is coming, let's kill ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated with how people come to do this. So I've studied it. And in each one of those cases, you find that there's a physical isolation. And so while I was in the cult that I was in, I said, well, we're not like that, because there's no physical isolation. I can come and go as I please, right? And then I began to study deeper, and I came to realize that it's rarely the case where there's a physical isolation. It's usually in the head. Usually they have you create mental barriers around the people. And so you can go right up to somebody's face and talk to them and not actually engage them, because you've shut them off. You put up this wall of isolation between you and them. And then after I left, I started thinking about all of that because it's something that I had thought about quite often. And I started noticing myself right after we left, whenever I would engage in conversation of spiritual things with another Christian who wasn't a cult Christian. And I began to realize that I'm having trouble following their train of thought because I'm putting up this mental barrier between them. And I was really struggling. And so I started attending a men's group, and they had, the Bible studies, etc. Started scheduling lunches where I could go talk to people, try to break out of that mold. And I found it was very difficult. After you've been manipulated to isolate yourself in your head for so long, you become a mental hermit. And that's what I was.
Yeah. And you are taught to defend everything that you are taught to believe. So, and you are given this position, like you are going to be attacked by other Christians and of course, certainly by non-believers for these set of beliefs. And so there was this sort of practice of how do you defend your belief, the apologetics, of how do I defend my belief against these particular attacks, so that when someone says something, and I have this mental isolation where it's like, I believe this very specific thing and I need to hold on to it. And here are the 6 ways that I can defend it in this situation, rather than just being like, okay, you can hear other people's beliefs and you can weigh them on their own and go through that sort of process that is an epistemically humble process of just being like, I don't know what I know, I don't know what I don't know. And I need to hear other people out and not be threatened by people having different belief systems than me. There just wasn't that option. There wasn't that space to find common ground with other Christians, much less other people of different faiths. There was something that I have here written that I wanted to read to you. It's not something that I had written, but this was in the Ernie Gruen report about the International House of Prayer. Well, this is actually pre-International House of Prayer, but this is a pastor who was very critical of Mike Bickle and Bob Jones and a lot of the abusive sort of prophetic patterns that they did. And he was the one who kind of organized the report, but there was a lot of different individuals who testified to it and wrote their own opinions about different things. So it wasn't just Ernie Gruen. But I was reading back through it recently, and I thought it was something that I should read to you, because there was this Dominion Christian school that the Kansas City Fellowship community had established that was a children's school that I went to. I went only on Fridays. They had a Friday school, and I was largely homeschooled, but on Fridays I would go to it. I only have the vaguest recollection of being a part of that school, but someone wrote about it, and in the report, they said that it is my belief that Dominion's Kansas City Fellowship's Christian School lackadaisical attitude about education is not conducive to a sound learning environment. To quote one child, "If I can go to the third heaven and get out of a test, more power to me." And then later they wrote about it. They said, "We all have a problem when an entire group of precious children are being subjected to these absurdities. In both the church and in their Christian school, they are indoctrinated to believe that their specific generation is the elected seed of all the bloodlines of all generations, foreknown, predestined, and hand-selected from billions of other seeds to be a part of the end times Omega generation." That was all Bob Jones' prophecies. "They are told that they will do 10,000 times the miracles in the book of Acts, and that they will be 10 times worse than I, Bob Jones, am in regards to seeing angels and demons and walking in the supernatural, and that their generation is specifically called the manifest sons of God. They are taught that out-of-body experiences are the norm. One mother described her son's experiences with a friend from Kansas City Fellowship. She said that my son spent the night with his cousin, who still goes to KCF. Later, they all went upstairs and sat in a circle. Then the 7-year-old son, who was one of the KCF leaders, told them if they held hands, they could go into the third heaven and see angels and taste the tree of life. From a Christian counselor, it is my belief that Dominion..." I already quoted that, but its lackadaisical attitude towards education is not conducive to a sound learning environment. There are accounts told from visiting parents who saw children at Dominion lying in the halls for great lengths of time, experiencing uncontrollable weeping or giggling, and were told these children were simply drunk in the spirit. And I remember reading this actually just very recently. I had read some of this in the past, but then I'll go back to the Aaron Gruen report just to see what sticks out with me that is new. And I totally forgot about this entire account because I went to a school called the Daniel Academy, which was an offshoot of the International House of Prayer. It was connected with, not in any official capacity, but all of the community was IHOP community. The leaders of it were my own father, and then Bob Frazier and Lauren Frazier, who were ministry partners with my dad and who led the Joseph Company. So it was all very directly tied with the International House of Prayer. And during the years of 2009 to 2010, there was what I'm sure that you've heard about, but there was the student awakening that happened at the International House of Prayer, where the college students at the university of with IHOP, which I don't like calling it a university because it's not a university, it's not accredited or anything like that. But their college organization had a bunch of individuals who were suddenly being slain in the spirit. There's a lot of different manifestations of God's presence. There were people seeing dreams, and there was just this big sort of exciting energy that had bubbled up there. Well, it quickly caught on at the high school, the Daniel Academy, that was a part of it. And we would have these morning services where it would be 30 minutes where people would pray and worship, and then we would go about our day. That was part of the Daniel Academy sort of curriculum, and the way that it would happen is that we would always have morning prayer service. Well, what started happening is that there would be manifestations of the Holy Spirit during these morning prayer services, and children would fall over out of their seats and they would be laughing, and we'd have prayer tunnels that people would run through and fall out with the Holy Spirit, and people speaking in tongues, all that sort of stuff. And we wouldn't end up going to classes. So most of my senior year in high school, I didn't really go to class. We just had these things happen. And I honestly, even as like an 18-year-old, or 17-year-old, however old I was, I kind of was a part of it too. Like I remember encouraging it and having some of these, like praying up front and really being excited about it. And it just didn't feel important that education was getting thrown off to the side, because what was happening was the realization of all of these prophecies that I had been told growing up. Like, this was the Joel's army sort of coming to life. These were all the young kids who were suddenly prophesying. And I remember I had a few dreams during that time, and I thought, oh, this is now kind of happening to me. And there were some questions that I had. There was a few things that I was like, this isn't quite right. But largely, I was just very excited about it. And what ended up happening is that it just was extremely academically negligent. I got a really poor education during my time at the Daniel Academy. Even before that happened, the teachers there weren't trained to be teachers. There were a lot of volunteers, despite both my father and Bob Frazier being multimillionaires. It just didn't have any funding. There was mold throughout the entire building. The whole message of the Daniel Academy is that it was going to be this special school that raised up these special Daniel-like students who would go out into the marketplace and go out into the 7 spheres of influence and who would be set apart and be able to excel like Daniel did and be able to interpret the king's dreams and all that sort of stuff. And the irony is we just weren't being equipped to just handle life in general. Like, it was a high school. We were supposed to be learning how to study, how to reading, math, and science. Like, those are the things that we could have learned to equip us. And instead, it was these weird miracles and poor education, not enough funding for the students. And then there was a lot of, some other students could speak to this better than me, my sisters specifically, but there was just a lot of, like, there was abuse that was going on. There was sexual abuse that happened among the student body that was handled horrifically. There just wasn't good leadership in general. And for me, it gave such a great indication of how this message and this type of gospel and this type of religion, ideology, this latter rain movement in general, is just so destructive to its own kind. It's not. There's some cult groups where it gets you isolated and selfish, and you're not good for the rest of society, but at least you succeed and flourish in your own little world. But like, it doesn't even give you the tools to succeed in your own world. I don't think that anyone who graduated from the Daniel Academy is like actively involved in leadership right now. I think almost everyone who I know of has completely left that world entirely because there just is not good fruit that comes from that community. There's a lot of good people. There's a lot of, and I'm sure there's some individuals who appreciated their time and experience there. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush there, but largely it was a negligent upbringing. And to then now see, so then I pull up the Ernie Gruen report, and it kind of breaks my heart to see that, that was happening in the 80s and the 90s. And my parents and the leaders, Mike Bickle and others, were being warned about the detriment of these programs that they were running. People were pointing it out, saying, hey, this is not good for your own children. Your children are talking about, listening to Bob Jones and talking about opening their third eye. And that's cuckoo banana shit. Like, that's just too much. And there were warnings about it, and yet nothing was changed. And so I had to go through the same experiences that people were going through in the 80s and 90s. And I'm concerned the Daniel Academy still exists. Like, the Bethel Academy still exists. There's a lot of these schools that are about equipping the young generation. And it's just destructive, and it's going to keep going because these warnings are falling on deaf ears.
I think that's one of the biggest problems that I had with this. We didn't call it Joel's Army. We didn't call it Manifested Sons of God. I didn't know that was a thing until I started my research, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a name for this thing that we have. Right. And what's funny is if you go back and you study the histories, it's not credited to Branham that all of this came from, but I can find him teaching it long before the guys who are credited with starting this. So and I don't think Branham invented it. I think it was an emerging collaboration. It was like, these guys cross-pollinated. So I believe it was an evolution into this, and one guy claimed it. But that was one of the biggest problems that I had, because when you're focused on creating the army for the end of days, you're not focused on living out until the end of days.
Right.
And all of the children, so we talked beforehand. I was one of the fortunate ones. I actually went to public school because my parents thought that this was nonsense, that you can't go to public school. So I went, but many of my peers did not. They were homeschooled. And there were these pseudo homeschool curriculums that the way it worked in many states, you had to get an official approved curriculum. But what they would do is they would get that, and they would get some cult thing, and they would just kind of blend it together,
right?
Focusing more heavily on the cult than they did in actual education. I had a problem with this, and I knew some people who there's no way that they could have ever amounted to anything beyond just grunt labor, because that's all they had. They didn't have the skills, right? And then when we moved to Jeffersonville, and I got married, my wife was a school teacher. She's got a master's degree in education, but her family was more in favor of the homeschool thing. So I let my kids do it, and we began to notice that there's just huge problems with the way that they're teaching school. They're not teaching school is the problem. And they focused on our prophetic history. So my kids could tell you that backwards and forward, but the things that they need to know to survive, they had no idea. They knew, there are elements that they had to know to pass the board-approved curriculums, etc.
Yeah.
But it never went beyond that, because it always focused on, did you know there was a prophet and an angel came down to see all this nonsense, right? So we had a problem with this. We ended up taking our kids out of the group thing, and we did our own homeschooling. And the whole thing is just, I look back and I regret that I put my kids through this, because they're doing well now, but they had to really struggle to get back in touch with reality. Once you've been robbed of that, that's robbing a child of his education, basically. Once you've been robbed of that, you can't just give it to them. It takes a lot of time and effort, and not just for you, but for them as well. So I'm glad we're not part of that, but I'm really saddened to know that it's not just our cult that had that. This was spreading across multiple splinter groups.
Yeah, and the reasoning behind it, even in my community, is this: well, we're going to raise these children up who then will go out into the 7 spheres of influence and be able to be messengers for the gospel. But I had no idea how to interact with people who didn't believe the same things that I did, because I was so isolated, going back to that isolation thing. So not only was there not the being equipped with a proper education, you also just you don't know how to interact with someone who is a Buddhist, don't know how to interact with someone who is an atheist, and don't know how to interact with someone who is, especially if someone is in like the LGBTQ community, and you short circuit because you're like, I don't know how to interact with a person who has different pronouns or something like that. Like there's no exposure to the rest of the world. And so this fanciful idea that these children will be equipped to go out into the world and be sources of light is just silly. It's just a silly idea, because of course what happens, we go out into the world and we're totally ill-equipped, and we get run over and swallowed. Living in a place like Los Angeles is going to eat you up so quickly if you are not ready to know how to swim in this environment. And it's a lot of children who are just not being taught how to swim, and then expecting them to suddenly not just go into the current and know how to swim, but to be these beacons of light. And it clearly is not working. It clearly is, there's a big question that religious leaders of this sort of latter rain NAR movement have to address at some point, is how many of their own children are completely abandoning the religion entirely. It just, the Joel's army that was supposed to be raised up is almost exclusively agnostic and atheists, or certainly, even if they are Christian, not NAR versions of Christianity, because so many people are just abandoning that because there's no way, it's not sustainable. I think of myself specifically, even if I had wanted to stay in that world, there absolutely was no option for me to do it. there's no coherent path for me to honestly live in this world, unless I just became a liar like my father or like Mike Bickle. There was no way for me to honestly survive in the world that I grew up in.
No, it's difficult to survive. I mean, you can, but it takes a lot of work. And, in the end, it really comes down to this. We live in a world where education is key to surviving. You have to have at least the basics of an education. So if you leave and you've been robbed of this, then one of the first things that you have to do is further your education. But, you mentioned people leaving the faith. This is common also among the message cult people. Whenever a Branhamite gets into the real world and realizes that they have been robbed of their education and start to get one, there's another interesting problem that happens. When you are educated of the things of the world, and I'm not talking about just secular, I'm talking about world history in general. You're educated in the good guys, the villains, the history, the good, bad, and ugly. You start to see patterns in that history, and then you suddenly start to think, wait a minute, I grew up in a religion where it matches that pattern. I don't care which history figure, Hitler, for example. You look at how he manipulated the masses and the things that he did, it clearly matches many of these cults and charismatic leaders. And you start studying that history and you're like, well, what do you do with that, man? And because they have so closely tied the cult and its ideology to what they say was Christianity, they're one and the same in the cult mind, we have to give it up. So people just leave it all together. And in the end, it's another thing that you have to process after you leave. What was that I was in? What good was it? What did it do for me? And then the harder part is not everything that they taught you was bad. So you have to kind of weed out what was good, what was bad, what's useful, what's not useful. And I will say in the balanced scales of life, the useful is like way down here, but it's a process and it's a difficult process, but I'm glad that you're able to come through it. And I'm hoping that somebody listening can realize that there are ways to get around this and to move forward in life. And I hope something that we've said can help somebody to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably been one of the most heartbreaking things that I've had to deal with, even in this last year or 2 years, where all of the scandal with Mike Bickle and my own father, and really realizing some of the degree of the depravity of the world that I grew up in is I've had to fight so hard to hold on to the good of not just the community that I was raised in, but the people and the virtues. It has felt so choked out, because all of the toxic messages has been intertwined with all of that, which is good. And it's hard not to feel this sort of nihilistic, just throw out all meaning, throw out all value, all of it is for naught. And fighting to have the compassion, fighting to have the love and the understanding and the empathy that I was once taught as a young child is like one of the most difficult processes here to extricate the good from the bad. But I hope that, that people listening and my process of this and your own process of this can help others, because it is a worthwhile process to try to salvage which was good and meaningful from a world that was otherwise very corrupt.
Well, hopefully it's helped somebody. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon Audible.